As I reached the thicket and took cover, I came face to face with Lieutenant. Like me, his horse had been shot from under him, and he had gone through a similar experience to reach the thicket. The lieutenant was staring intently at the retreating column, likely wishing, just as I did, that he could be with it. I was relieved to see him, even under such dangerous circumstances. Until that moment, I had thought I was the only one left behind. The lieutenant then told me that 2 others had been left behind as well, and they were only a few yards from us. It turned out that the 2 men were Billy Jackson, one of our half-breed scouts, and Fred Girard, our interpreter. Lieutenant gathered us together and quickly gave us instructions on what to do if the Indians attacked, which we expected at any moment, knowing we could not remain undetected for long. We lay in a shallow depression in the sand, which I believed must have been the riverbed at some point in time. Some thick undergrowth surrounding the depression effectively concealed us from the view of the Indians, who were riding back and forth across the plain in front of our position, not more than 50 or 60 feet away. They were highly agitated, and their movements reminded me of an anthill disturbed, each warrior seeming focused on their own task. The lieutenant instructed us not to fire until we were discovered, something we anticipated could happen at any moment. We lay on our stomachs, with our heads just level with the edge of the depression, keeping a close watch in all directions, ready to fire as soon as we saw anyone approaching. The lieutenant maintained a sharp lookout in every direction and encouraged us to stay calm. "Men," he said, "we all have to face death eventually, but I hope we can escape this danger yet." It wasn't long before a group of squaws came close to our position. They were collecting their own dead and wounded, their grief strikingly evident as they wailed and cried. They stripped the dead bodies of our men of their clothing and mutilated them in every way imaginable using the knives they carried. Some of their actions were clearly visible to us. It made me feel faint and sick to think how soon they might be able to do the same to me, so I resolved to fight as fiercely as possible if we were discovered. Because of our advantageous position, we estimated that we could take down several of our attackers before they could overwhelm us. I didn't know what Lieutenant was hoping for, but I can say that all of my own hopes vanished, and I never expected to leave that place alive. My entire life seemed to unfold before my eyes, taking me back to the old home in the East and to friends I hadn't thought about in years. All the major events of my life rushed forward, one after another, so quickly that for a moment, I forgot about the immediate danger surrounding me. An hour passed, then 2, then 3, and still no attempt was made to capture us, nor were we discovered. We remained hidden until darkness began to settle over the plain. After a brief, quiet discussion, we decided to try to find the command, if any of them were still alive, though we had serious doubts. "Indians don't fight at night," the lieutenant said in a low voice. "If we stay together and you follow my orders, I believe we can make it to the command alive." We had no idea how Custer or Reno were faring. We had heard heavy gunfire coming from both up and down the river and knew the losses must have been severe. Personally, I thought that when the shooting stopped in the direction Custer had gone, it meant he had retreated toward Major Reno's position. I believe it was around 5 o'clock when we heard the final shots from Custer's direction. However, Major Reno's men continued firing at intervals, as if they were being attacked, but by nightfall all gunfire from that direction also stopped. We spoke very little, fearing the Indians might hear us. But now, we made the decision to leave our hiding place, though we knew it was a risky move, even after night had fallen. We looked around and listened closely, but couldn't hear or see anything. The moon was up, shining through a haze, but not very brightly. So we resolved to make a break for our lives no matter the risk, as it seemed to be our only chance. We couldn't stay where we were until daylight. Of course, we had not had anything to eat or drink. It had been an incredibly hot day, and our throats were parched. I might have been thirstier than the others, since while on the skirmish line with the command, I had tripped over my foot while maneuvering, falling flat on my face and causing my nose to bleed heavily. since I couldn't tend to it at the time. The blood had flowed down my throat and nearly choked me. It felt as though I might die from thirst before I could reach any water. When we left the thicket, Gerard and Jackson were mounted on ponies they had hidden in the brush. The lieutenant and I were still on foot. We had not traveled far when we came upon a horrific sight. We had reached the place where our command had encountered the Indians during their retreat. The savages had attacked them, killing several of our men, who were lying there, stripped of their clothing and horribly mutilated by the knives of the squaws. We didn't stay long at this scene. There was nothing we could do for the men. They were beyond help. We continued along the trail as best as we could in the dim light, with the path clearly marked by the bodies of the fallen troopers and their horses. We had barely advanced halfway toward the river when we encountered a group of mounted Indians, about 8 or 10 in number. They would have come directly toward us, but they veered off to our right, about 100 yards away. Lieutenant Derudio and I tried to conceal ourselves behind the ponies ridden by Gerard and Jackson, hoping we might be mistaken for members of their group. However, the Indians seemed suspicious and quickly fled in the opposite direction, for which we were, needless to say, extremely relieved. Speeding up our pace, we soon reached the river at the point where the command had ridden their horses into the stream during their desperate retreat. We scanned the opposite bank, hoping to find any sign of where they had climbed the steep bluff, but all we could see was a high, sheer bank. A little further, there appeared to be a flat stretch of river bottom, about 50 yards wide. The lieutenant quietly instructed me to wade into the water to check its depth. Grasping some bushes at the edge, I slid in. The water came up nearly to my neck with the first step, and the current was so strong it nearly knocked me off balance. With the lieutenant's help, I hurriedly climbed out, but he wasn't satisfied and wanted to try it himself. I held onto him as he eased into the stream, but he soon concluded that crossing here was impossible for us. It was the first opportunity we had to drink water in many long, exhausting hours. I removed my large slouch hat, which could hold about a gallon, filled it from the stream, and passed it around. Each man drank until he was satisfied, and we all agreed it was the sweetest water we had ever tasted. The night was passing, and we carefully searched the bank of the fast-moving stream for a place to ford. Due to the melting snow in the mountains, which made all the local streams swell beyond their banks at that time of year, crossing seemed like a dangerous task. Behind us and downriver, we could see and hear large groups of Indians holding a war dance around blazing piles of wood and brush. The flames illuminated their surroundings, and we could clearly see their figures jumping and waving weapons. The eerie sight of those savages will stay with me forever, with their shouts and war cries echoing up and down the valley. The only sound resembling music was a repetitive, "ha ha ha ha." Later, we learned that they had the heads of 3 of our comrades, and that these men had been partly burned in the fires by these ruthless warriors. It seemed that even the squaws were participating in the wild dancing. From the noise and excitement, it was clear to us that the Indians had been successful that day. Since we hadn't heard anything from our comrades since nightfall, we figured they might have used the cover of darkness to retreat even further. One thing we were certain of, our only chance of survival was to get across the river. We continued our cautious march upstream, trying unsuccessfully to find a ford. We eventually decided to return to the place where the command had crossed earlier in the afternoon when they first attacked the village. Upon reaching a spot that seemed promising, I waded into the water and found the current to be slower, with the water only coming up to just above my knees. The others followed, and we crossed what we thought was the main stream, only to later discover that we were actually on an island. The river split a short distance upstream, with water running along both sides of this strip of land, which stretched nearly a mile long and several hundred yards wide. The island was covered with dense clumps of bulberry bushes, some as large as 20 square yards, along with young cottonwood trees and tall, thick grass that reached up to our waists. We crossed the island diagonally, assuming we were heading toward the opposite bank, but soon we encountered the river once again. This confused us greatly. We hadn't noticed the island when we had ridden to the attack earlier that afternoon. and we began to wonder if we had somehow lost our sense of direction. We attempted to cross the main stream again, but it was pointless, as all we saw on the other side were steep bluffs, which we couldn't possibly scale. As we moved cautiously, we came upon one of the thick clumps of bulberry bushes when a voice suddenly called out, startling us. The deep, guttural tones were unmistakably those of an Indian, and Gerard and Jackson instantly spun their ponies around and galloped away in the direction we had come from. That was the last we saw of them until we reunited in camp the following night. Lieutenant DeRudio and I were about 10 yards apart when the challenge was heard. I saw him kneeling in the tall grass and quickly followed his lead. If we had tried to flee, there was a clear stretch of nearly 100 yards we would have had to cross before reaching cover, and the Indians would surely have opened fire on us. After Jackson and Gerard bolted, there was no further sound. The Indians, suspecting something was wrong, hurriedly rode their horses into the river, causing chaos and confusion. To cover their retreat, Lieutenant DeRudio fired 2 shots from his revolver in quick succession. I had my carbine aimed at them and fired a shot as well. While I was reloading, the lieutenant fired another round. By that time, they had already crossed the river. Although I hadn't seen them, only hearing the commotion, the lieutenant, who was closer to the river, said he could make out 6 or 7 Indians, seemingly stationed at the fork in the river where it split to form the island. I was about to take a second shot when Lieutenant DeRudio called out, "O'Neill, they are all gone." Perhaps the Indians were exhausted from the day's battle, or maybe we had caught them napping. I believe it was around 2 o'clock at that point. We retreated a few hundred yards and then wandered around the island, confused by how we seemed to be trapped, surrounded by both water and Indians. After this, we were too wary to approach the ford we had crossed earlier in the day, fearing we might run into more Indian sentries. We walked back and forth along the river, searching for a crossing, but I became so fatigued and worn out that I finally said, "Lieutenant, please let us rest. My boots are full of water, and my clothes are soaking wet. I need to wring them out." We found a clump of brush to sit in, and I began removing some of my clothes, boots, and stockings. Just as I finished wringing out my soaked clothes and started putting them back on, we were once again startled by the sound of galloping hooves and voices. By the time we realized how late it had become, the morning was already dawning. The Indians were passing by, heading toward the riverbank to start another attack on Reno's command. The lieutenant had managed to get his boots back on, and I was struggling with mine. As he stood up and looked out, he saw a column of mounted figures moving about 200 or 300 yards away. He whispered to me, his voice full of excitement, "O'Neill, I think that's the command." By then, I had my boots on and joined him. We could see the riders, but the gray light of dawn made it hard to tell who they were. They were riding in large numbers, and we could hear their voices but not distinguish individual words. Some had climbed the bluff using a cut in the bank that we hadn't noticed before. The lieutenant spotted a man dressed in a buckskin outfit, someone he thought was Captain or Tom Custer, since he had worn similar clothing on the expedition. In a hushed voice, DeRudio said, "That has to be Tom Custer." Some of the riders had reached the top of the opposite bluff and were looking down at the island where we were. The rider we thought to be Tom Custer was just about to ascend the cut in the bank. I was almost certain it was Captain Custer, and the thought of rejoining my comrades filled me with hope. At that moment, Lieutenant DeRudio stepped out onto the riverbank and called, "Hey, Tom Custer, Tom Custer!" The riders paused and turned their attention toward us, and before we could react, the terrifying sound of a war whoop echoed through the air, followed by a volley of at least 50 gunshots. We were fortunate to escape unharmed, as bullets whizzed past, striking the brush all around us. The riders were Sioux Indians, wearing uniforms they had taken from Custer's men after the previous day's battle, and they were mounted on horses captured from the 7th Cavalry. Our narrow escape was truly miraculous. The Indians made no attempt to follow us across the river. We dove into the bushes on the opposite side and crawled low to the ground, keeping our backs hidden above the grass. Moving stealthily, we made our way toward another patch of thick brush. But just as we rounded the corner, we collided with another group of mounted Indians. The encounter was so sudden that we almost ran into each other. There were 6 or 7 Indians in this group, and our appearance startled their ponies, causing them to rear and thrash about. It was clear that these warriors hadn't expected us to come from that direction, though some of the Indians on the hill were shouting down to warn their comrades. I immediately readied my carbine, while the lieutenant, who had been holding his pistol for hours, fired first. I followed suit, and our shots rang out. The Indian ponies were rearing and bucking so wildly that their riders were struggling to maintain control. This confusion gave us an advantage, allowing us to fire 8 shots in rapid succession. I'm certain 2 of the riders fell, and I saw 3 ponies gallop away without their riders. It's likely that we wounded others, though some of them managed to stay on their horses. This encounter was overwhelmingly one-sided in our favor. We were in a position of strength, grounded and able to deliver rapid and precise shots. We stood shoulder to shoulder, and I didn't even raise my carbine to my shoulder. The Indians were so close that I simply pointed it in their direction and fired. Though I honestly doubted I would survive another 5 minutes, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing I had caused significant damage in the brief time we had. I've often wondered if those few Indians who managed to flee considered us as demons in that dusky June morning, inflicting so much harm in such a short span of time. The lieutenant was an expert shot with his revolver, quickly firing 5 rounds, each of which I'm sure found its mark. I fired 3 shots from my carbine. The Indians only managed 1 shot at us, but it missed entirely. Then Derrudio yelled for me to run. The last thing I saw as we fled was a few Indians lying on the ground and several ponies struggling to regain their balance. As we ran, about 150 yards from the spot of our last encounter, we stumbled upon an unexpected advantage. On this small island, there was a perfect defensive position. Some time earlier, a group of cottonwood trees had been felled, leaving stumps about 3 feet high. A later flood had carried many of the logs into the stumps, where they had settled, forming a natural barricade, a perfect place to make a stand. Lieutenant Derrudio's keen eye spotted it immediately, and he called out, "Quick, O'Neill, get in!" Without hesitation, he dove into the cover of the logs, and I followed him. We maneuvered deeper into the pile of logs and debris, finding ourselves completely sheltered. Any Indian who wanted to reach us would first have to cross an open stretch of nearly 100 yards and then scale our makeshift barricade. We were secure for the moment. We exchanged a grim handshake, both of us agreeing that we couldn't move another step. If death was to come, we were ready to face it there, fighting. I removed my cartridge belt and found I had only 25 rounds left for the carbine and 12 for the pistol. Since the lieutenant was the more accurate shot with the pistol, I handed him mine along with the remaining ammunition, keeping the carbine for myself. Just as we settled into our makeshift shelter, we heard the fierce sound of musketry from the hills, about a mile away. It was clear the Indians had resumed their attack on Reno's command, and we could hear the reply from our comrades. We also heard the war cries of the Indian chiefs, shouting to their warriors down by the river. A few shots were fired in our direction, but we stayed silent, keeping our heads down, and made no response. Throughout this time, we stayed alert, expecting the Indians to charge at any moment. We scanned every direction, waiting for the inevitable assault. The ground sloped downward behind us, leading to the river, which was about 200 yards away. There was a clear area around us, stretching nearly 100 yards, and tall grass obscured much of our view. We remained vigilant, constantly watching for any Indians attempting to sneak up on our position. We figured that if they charged, we might manage to take down 5 or 6 of them. I didn't think they knew exactly where we were, though a few of their bullets struck the logs protecting us. Occasionally, we glimpsed small groups of them, no closer than 250 yards, but we kept our heads down and refrained from firing, not wanting to reveal our location. The lieutenant gave me clear instructions. When they come into the open and seem to be searching for us, take aim at the leader, and then keep firing as they approach, but only when you're absolutely sure of your shot, At target practice, I could hit something the size of my hat at 200 yards every time. My nerves, once frazzled, had calmed. I was so resigned to our fate that I felt steadier than ever before, convinced I could shoot as well as I ever had. We didn't expect to survive this, but the lieutenant said it was our duty to hold out as long as possible. Surrendering meant certain death, likely in the most brutal form. At this point, the Indians made another charge on the hill, but once again, they were repelled. Afterward, sporadic gunfire continued, as we later learned, with the Indians picking off several soldiers during the pauses between attacks. It was now around 9 a.m. on the 26th, and we began to wonder how long the Indians would wait before coming after us. We spoke in low voices. The lieutenant said, "O'Neill, I think they're too afraid to come for us now. They don't know exactly where we are, and they've learned they'll lose more than they'll gain if they push us." He added, "That lesson we gave them earlier might just save our lives." Then, after a pause, DeRudio asked, "O'Neill, are you married?" "No, sir," I replied. "Well," he said, "I wouldn't be so concerned if I were on my own, but I keep thinking about what my wife and 3 young kids will do if I don't make it. That's what's weighing on me." Just then, we heard voices and the sound of horses nearby. Cautiously peering out, we saw large groups of women and children moving along the river bottom, heading toward the mountains. The women, like the men, were riding and carrying their babies on their backs. Children as young as 6 were mounted on ponies, and all the children were riding. Their belongings, cooking tools, provisions, and other supplies were packed on travois while ponies were led or driven along. We were relieved that we were hidden from view as they passed. The women seemed cheerful, singing and chatting with each other. It took about an hour for them to pass, and at times their groups stretched across wide expanses, some as wide as 200 yards. They were not traveling in any specific formation. Eventually, they all passed out of sight. Though we couldn't see any Indians now, we knew they were still on the bluffs above us, as we could hear occasional charges on the command. Slowly, our hopes began to rise. We held out hope that the command would be able to push the Indians back, unaware of how badly the troops had been weakened and how much they were struggling just to defend themselves. Hour after hour passed, and by around 3 p.m., it seemed the Indians launched their final, most desperate charge against the command. The attack was fiercer than any that had come before it, with intense musket fire, war whoops, and cheers from the troopers. We later learned that Reno's position was atop the highest bluff, with the ground sloping down and several deep cuts running off in every direction. The soldiers were positioned around the top of the bluff, and to reach them, the Indians had to climb the steep sides. In the final charge, a few of the Indians made it to the top before being killed, but the troopers counterattacked, and the casualties among the Indians were so heavy that they ceased their efforts to overtake the bluff. Had they succeeded in breaking the line, not a man would have survived to tell the story. By 5 o'clock, the firing had nearly stopped. We saw no more signs of the Indians, and I finally asked the lieutenant if I could venture out to scout. He gave me permission, so I crawled out to get a better look. Across the river on the high bank, I spotted a lone Indian on horseback, likely on picket duty. I moved cautiously to a spot with more brush cover and stood up for a clearer view. On our side of the river, just 300 yards away, I saw 15 Indians sitting in a circle, smoking and talking. They were near the riverbank, and after a quick survey of the area, I dropped back down and crawled back to the lieutenant to report my findings. We resumed our watch, now more certain than ever that the Indians were preparing to search for us before leaving. Since there was no further gunfire or signs from the command, we suspected that the troopers had retreated and that most of the Indians had followed them, leaving only a few behind to watch the spot where we had been last seen. As the sun began to set and darkness approached, our hope of escaping grew stronger. However, I became so nervous that I couldn't contain myself, and for the first time that day, fear began to take hold of me. The silence around us was eerie, and I often imagined I saw Indians creeping up on us, so much so that I nearly fired my weapon as the nightfall crept in. This was when Lieutenant DeRudio showed his true courage and composure. He calmed me with his steady advice and reassuring presence, saying, "O'Neill, we'll make it through this if you can just be patient a little longer. From what we learned last night, I'm certain the Indians won't shoot at night if we happen to run into them. We now know how to cross the river, and if we don't find the command, we'll retrace our steps back to the Yellowstone, traveling by night and hiding by day. We can scrounge for food in old camps, maybe hunt a deer or an antelope. I believe we can reach the far west in 5 days, but I hope we'll find the command on the other side of the river. If we do, we'll be all right." We hadn't eaten in nearly 40 hours and hadn't had a drink all day, which was blisteringly hot. Our throats were parched, but I didn't feel particularly hungry. Night fell around 9 o'clock, and we carefully left our hiding spot, crawling through the tall grass to the river's edge. After checking for danger, we waded across and climbed the steep bank. It was completely quiet. Not a sound was to be heard except the wind rustling through the grass and sagebrush. Once on the other side, we wrung out our clothes and dried ourselves as best we could. We estimated we were about a mile from where we thought Reno's command was positioned, but after walking for a while and hearing nothing, we began to think the troops might have retreated. Our next decision was to follow the trail toward the Rosebud and then to the Yellowstone. We had a sense of the general direction, and we aimed to cross the divide to the Rosebud and then wait in the brush until nightfall to continue our march toward safety. We continued our march along a dry creek bed for about a mile until we came upon a high knoll rising before us. Deciding to climb to the top, we hoped to spot any campfires in the distance. Once we reached the summit, we scanned the area in all directions but saw no sign of fire. Just as we were about to resume our march, feeling disheartened, we heard the unmistakable braying of a mule coming from the direction where Reno's command had been. That sound, which was music to our ears, changed everything for us. It was clear that the mule must belong to our command, so we decided to search for them, despite the risk. We knew it was a dangerous undertaking. If we were certain the mule belonged to our men, we could approach and call out, but we remembered our terrifying encounter that morning when we had mistaken strangers for our comrades. We weren't about to take that chance again. The last thing we wanted was to be shot by our own men, mistaking us for Indians. We continued on in the direction of the mule's braying, stopping frequently to listen for any more sounds. Eventually, we got close enough to hear voices, but we couldn't tell if they belonged to our troops. Our situation grew more perilous by the moment. Crawling on our stomachs, inching forward with every movement, we feared that any moment we'd be discovered. Sometimes the voices seemed to belong to Indians, but at other times they sounded familiar. Then we heard someone shout, "Bring that horse here!" I recognized the voice of Sergeant McVeigh from a troop, and I immediately called out, "Mac, don't shoot! It's O'Neill and Lieutenant DeRudio." Several voices called back, "Come on in!" and we scrambled toward them as fast as we could. We were finally among our comrades. That night, after we were safely in camp, we had much to recount. We learned that Jackson and Gerard had arrived shortly before us. It turned out that after they had left us earlier, they had abandoned their ponies and hidden in thick brush throughout the day. Thankfully, the Indians hadn't passed near them, and they were safe. Like us, they found the camp after dark. Jackson, a young half-breed Indian scout, was brave and calm throughout the ordeal. By evening, the Indians had retreated up the river toward the mountains. The next morning, around 11 o'clock, General Terry and his command arrived. We then learned the devastating news that General Custer and every man of his command had been killed, about 3 miles from our position. Frequently, when I start reflecting on everything we endured during those grueling 36 hours of mental agony down in the river bottom, avoiding the Indians, I question whether it truly happened or if it was simply a dreadful nightmare. Thomas F. O'Neill's account of the Battle of the Little Bighorn gives us a glimpse into the brutal realities of war, where courage, fear, and survival instincts were put to the ultimate test. His story, filled with dramatic moments of intense conflict, captures the uncertainty and peril faced by those involved in the battle. Through his words, we gain a better understanding of the chaos that unfolded that day and the sacrifices made by those who fought. Despite the overwhelming odds, O'Neill's narrative serves as a testament to the resilience and determination of the men of the 7th Cavalry, whose bravery in the face of adversity would never be forgotten.